In the original trilogy, the rebellion appears to be pretty cohesive and united, with very little internal tension in contrast to the Empire. But both in Legends and in canon, this couldn't be farther from the case. Especially early on, the rebellion was a fractured mess of different rebel cells, many with their own motives, plans, and ideologies. In Andor, Saw Gerrera even laments this in a rant to Luthen Rael. But what were the different philosophies of the rebellion? What were the beliefs that divided these groups so sharply? In this video, we'll be taking a look at the major rebel leaders, their beliefs, and why these schisms arose. The most prominent of the different rebel philosophies was the one espoused by the Alliance to Restore the Republic, the faction that spearheaded the rebellion during the Galactic Civil War and eventually founded the New Republic. The ideology of the Alliance was almost entirely laid out by two of the senators that founded it into BBY, Senator Mon Mothma of Chandrila and Senator Bel Organa of Alderaan. The two of them were generally in agreement, ideologically speaking, and their beliefs were shared by most of the Alliance's other leaders, including the members of Alliance High Command and the leaders of many rebel cells, such as the Ghost Crew from Rebels. While Mon Mothma and Bel Organa started out as just two rebel leaders among many scattered across the galaxy, and while their ideology was originally just one of many in the rebellion, the growth and predominance of the Rebel Alliance ensured that their beliefs defined most of the rebellion. Strictly speaking, this philosophy was jointly developed by Mon Mothma and Bel Organa, but since Organa died shortly before the Battle of Yavin, Mon Mothma's influence was greater. In Legends, after the rise of the New Republic, this particular rebel ideology was known as Mothmatism, although this word was most frequently used by salty Imperials who just called about anyone who preferred democracy to military dictatorship a Mothmatist. But what did this ideology actually entail? Apart from the universal rebel belief in enacting change through violent revolution against the Empire, Mothma and her followers specifically sought to restore the Republic as it had been before Emperor Palpatine had twisted it beyond recognition. They were believers in democracy, equality, and pluralism, and wanted to see them restored as the guiding principles of a galaxy-spanning New Republic. Mothma and her followers were also concerned with restoring civil rights, ending the imperial persecution of non-humans, and abolishing slavery once again, among many other things. The Mothmatists wanted a new republic that was based on the old republic, but with some structural differences, such as reducing the power of the executive and the courts and decentralizing government affairs to give sectors and systems more autonomy. In Legends, the New Republic Mon Mothma eventually built even allowed systems to secede without consequences, while in canon, the New Republic capital regularly relocated from system to system to prevent it from prioritizing the interests of one central capital. All of this was in contrast to Mon Mothma's Rebel Alliance, however. The Alliance was a centralized, de facto elected dictatorship, albeit a temporary one that reformed into a more democratic system pretty much the moment the Emperor was dead. This was just a consequence of the realities of running a revolution, but nonetheless, it was something other rebel leaders took issue with, as we'll get to in a bit. In canon, the Rebel Alliance had a small civilian government to oversee the needs of the civilians under Alliance protection, but in Legends, Mon Mothma and Bel Organa were vehemently against establishing any sort of Republican exile type government. This was because, for one, they believed that establishing a rival state that claimed to be the legitimate galactic government would remind people of the Separatist movement, and for another, because they saw this as tantamount to recognizing the Empire as a legitimate state. One of the core philosophical principles Mothma and her followers maintained was that the Empire was an illegitimate government that had illegally overthrown the Republic, and their aim was to restore the Republic as it had been, not make something new. In pursuit of this goal, Mon Mothma, Bel Organa, and the other Alliance leaders were insistent on upholding a few key principles. While they were committed to violent revolution against the Empire and all that entailed, including the occasional morally questionable operation, they expected the rebellion to wage a lawful war, such as by not targeting civilians or treating Imperial prisoners of war properly. They were still labelled as terrorists by the Empire, and they were still waging asymmetric warfare against the government, but they did restrain themselves in some respects, more so in canon than in legends. Their goal of restoring the Republic also led to conflicts with other rebel factions. For example, while the Alliance accepted Imperial defectors readily, unlike some other rebel groups, the Alliance was very hesitant about working with former Separatists. In Legends, this last issue was one of the only points that Mothma, Organa, and their followers disagreed on. Bel Organa, as well as other rebels that had been strongly loyalist during the Clone Wars, was fully opposed to working with Separatists of any sort on principle. Mon Mothma and most of the Alliance, meanwhile, were fine with working with Separatists in the abstract so long as they weren't guilty of war crimes. But Mon Mothma wanted to avoid ties with prominent Separatists to avoid association between the Alliance and the former Confederacy. Mothma and Organa had other differences as well, with Mothma favouring more aggressive action against the Empire than Organa. For the most part though, their philosophies were pretty closely aligned. In canon, Mon Mothma and Bel Organa were the original founders of the Alliance to restore the Republic, but in Legends, there was actually a third Alliance founder, Senator Bel Iblis of Corellia. Bel Iblis has significant philosophical differences with Organa and Mothma, and while the three of them originally worked together as the co-leaders of the Alliance, Bel Iblis split after Bel Organa's death, as the divide between him and Mothma deepened. Bel Iblis formed his own rebel faction, which waged its own campaign against the Empire, and he only reconciled with Mon Mothma in 9 ABY during the Thrawn campaign. A large part of this schism between Bel Iblis and Mon Mothma just came down to personal pride, but there were ideological conflicts as well. Bel Iblis was much more aggressively anti-authority than Mon Mothma was. He believed strongly in the Corellian philosophy of independence and skepticism of authority, and he sought a much more decentralized New Republic than Mothma did. Bel Iblis's skepticism of authority was what had caused his split with Mothma to begin with. He opposed the de facto dictatorship the Alliance was run by, and he came to believe that Mon Mothma was only out for power, looking to set herself up as Emperor in Palpatine's place. In many ways, Bel Iblis's resistance movement had more of a separatist spirit than the mainstream Alliance, and indeed, Bel Iblis was more tolerant of former Separatists than Mothma or Organa, having no qualms with working with ones that weren't war criminals. Still, Bel Iblis was a former loyalist, and he wanted to see the Republic restored. He simply didn't trust Mon Mothma to do so, to the point that, after the Battle of Endor, he had his resistance group prepare to start fighting the New Republic, believing that she would declare herself Empress soon. Bel Iblis's people never actually started fighting the New Republic, however. They just kept fighting the Empire, and they eventually reconciled with the New Republic. In canon, Bel Iblis's equivalent is Saw Gerrera, whose ideology was much more distinct. Unlike Bel Iblis, Saw was never associated with the Rebel Alliance. He had his own group, the Partisans, which fought the Empire all through the Dark Times. Saw and the Partisans were much different from the Alliance, but there was actually philosophical common ground between them. Saw, like the Alliance, actually wanted to restore the Republic, and while he hated the Empire above all, he also hated the Separatists and refused to work with them on principle, like Bel Organa. Of course, unlike the Alliance, Saw also strongly distrusted and usually wouldn't work with Imperial defectors either. But the similarities really end there. The Partisans' fight was less about restoring the principles of the Republic than it was about striking back against the unfathomable evil of the Empire, doing whatever they could to undermine it as much as they could. Saw's ideology was an aggressive anti-imperialism, one that viewed anyone that directly or indirectly helped the Imperial war machine as a collaborator and a legitimate target. In contrast to the organized, disciplined Alliance, Saw's partisans were much looser, decentralized, and more of a gang than an army, and they chafed at Mon Mothma's attempts to tone police and organize them. Saw refused to accept any other authority out of suspicion and philosophical differences, and unlike most other rebel groups, the partisans were uncompromising in their war against the Empire. Saw Gerrera believed that anything was justified to weaken or destabilize the Empire. He and his partisans fought ruthlessly as a result, and unlike the Alliance, they often bent or disregarded the laws of war in order to gain the edge over the enemy. They would torture prisoners, break standard rules of engagement, and even kill civilians, justifying these things as necessary evils, tactics that the power of the Empire forced on anyone who was serious about dismantling it. This was because Saw saw the rebellion as a total war, wherein anything that contributes to an enemy nation's war effort, including things like civilian industry, agriculture, and sometimes even civilians themselves, are considered legitimate targets. As he saw it, this was the kind of war that the Empire forced on the galaxy, and Saw and his fighters were simply responding in kind. If they did anything else, Saw believed, they would lose the galactic civil war. Saw and the partisans were also motivated by their hatred of the Empire, born of its innumerable atrocities. Unlike the Alliance, Saw and his followers weren't content to scheme. They wanted to fight, even though it wasn't strategically viable, and keep up the pressure on the Empire for as long as they could. Season 2 of Andor shows us that Saw believed he wouldn't live to see the restoration of the Republic, and he doesn't seem to have had much of a plan for it either. Rather, he and his partisans saw themselves as weapons doing their part for the cause. Eventually, their luck would run out, but along the way, the Empire would be weakened, and eventually, someone would succeed in toppling it. Saw may well have known that his approach was suicidal and that more careful strategies of the Alliance had a better chance of success, but even if he did, he just couldn't bear to not fight with all he had. In sharp contrast, we have Luthen Rael, the spy master that, in canon, was instrumental in laying the groundwork for the Rebel Alliance. As one of the leaders of the Axis network, alongside his assistant, Clea, Luthen served as an intermediary between the different rebel cells, and he provided support that the Alliance eventually built upon. But while he shared many of the Alliance's principles and aspirations, Luthen's philosophy had serious differences from those of the Alliance, and later Alliance and New Republic leaders generally preferred to forget about him and his contributions. For one, like Saw Gerrera, Luthen was much more willing to do morally questionable things to resist the Empire. He saw himself as someone committing to using the tools of the Empire against it, even when it put innocence at risk. In fact, Luthen repeatedly encouraged rebel activity that invited Imperial crackdowns, and this was something that tied into his ideology. Luthen believed that the Empire needed to be provoked into being harsher for people to recognize the oppression they faced and fight back against it. An ends justify the means philosophy that many rebels didn't share. In these respects, Luthen was very similar to Saw, but his approach couldn't have been more different. Luthen was a master manipulator, and instead of being eager to fight openly, he fought from the shadows, using sabotage, subterfuge, espionage, and many kinds of underhanded tactics to get the rebellion an edge. He was more than willing to sacrifice his allies in pursuit of greater objectives, and he was considered shifty and untrustworthy by the leaders of the Alliance. However, Luthen firmly believed that all of these things were justified if they helped bring down the Empire and restore the Republic. Andor also gives us another rebel with a distinct philosophy, Nemik, who lays out his beliefs in his manifesto. Nemik wasn't a rebel leader, but his distinct philosophy, which no doubt was shared by many rebel grunts, is worth a mention. Nemik's beliefs border on anarchist in nature, and they're more about the fight against the Empire than about restoring the Republic. Nemik's views on the Republic are unclear, in fact. His philosophy is instead defined by analysis of and staunch opposition to the Empire. On top of his specific analysis of how the Empire operates, Nemik's ideology is grounded in a quasi-anarchist analysis of imperial authority being an artificial imposition on a galactic populace that innately tends toward freedom. In contrast to the Empire's claims that the order and hierarchy it imposed were natural, Nemik claims the opposite. that freedom is what is natural, and that the Empire's authority and oppression are impositions that take constant, unsustainable effort to maintain. In contrast, the freedom that the rebellion promotes arises constantly and spontaneously through insurrection and resistance. Rather than being something the rebels are fighting for, Nemik defines freedom as something the rebels are creating just by fighting. He also claims that this isn't something people need to be taught. It's innate to sentient beings, and if given enough pressure, people will embrace it. In other words, Nemik not only believes that the cause of the rebellion is right, but that its victory is inevitable. Season 2 of Andor gives us a look at a much more moderate kind of rebel leader through Carro Rylanz, the leader of the Gorman Front. Rylanz, his followers, and those like him weren't dead set against the Empire as a whole. They were more concerned with the specific atrocities the Empire was carrying out, and their focus was narrow, concerned mostly with just their home system or sector. These sorts of local rebel cells were very common, and many of them ultimately joined the Rebel Alliance. They could vary in ideology, but the Gorman Front is pretty representative of how most of them thought. Carro Rylanz, for instance, never says anything about restoring the Republic or even overthrowing the Empire. On the contrary, he even seems to believe at one point that the Emperor had the galaxy's best interests in mind, and that abuses like those happening on Gorman were the work of other high-ranking Imperials abusing their power. Rylanz also wasn't really concerned with anything beyond the oppression on Gorman, and the aim of his resistance, according to him, was to show the Emperor what was really happening there, believing that Palpatine would intervene to stop it. This somewhat naive outlook was fairly common in regions that had been strongly loyalist during the Clone Wars, where Palpatine was still revered as a wartime hero who had led the Republic through its darkest hour. Still, Rylanz and the Gorman Front didn't shy away from violence, although they were very restrained about it. They primarily pursued symbolic rather than strategic aims, and fighters that would hit Imperial convoys one night would partake in peaceful demonstrations at other times. It was a moderate approach to rebellion in every way, and it was one that, ultimately, was met with genocide in response. This pattern wasn't limited to Gorman, and as a consequence, most moderate rebels like Rylanz either died or were radicalized by the time the Galactic Civil War really got going. Then there's the last kind of rebel group, the Separatists. While those Separatist holdouts that persisted after the end of the Clone Wars were all wiped out in the Empire's early years, a few small Separatist factions persisted, and they became part of the broader rebel collective during the Dark Times. New Separatist groups arose during the Dark Times as well, seeking independence from the Empire for their home systems or sectors. These new Separatists often aligned more with the Rebel Alliance than the former CIS, but there were also Separatist true believers out there, those that still upheld the Confederacy's principles. In Andor, Anto Krieger is presented as an example of the latter group, although no details are given about what he personally believed. In Legends, there was the former Separatist general Horn Ambigine, the leader of the Brix Freedom Fighters, who ultimately joined the Alliance, as well as the former Trade Federation captain Blox Hutha, who wasn't allowed to join the Alliance proper, but who worked as a rebel privateer. These beings all generally upheld a few Separatist principles that the mainstream Alliance vehemently opposed. They wanted their home sectors to assert their sovereignty and secede from the Empire, becoming independent or part of a confederation that allowed them to keep full sovereignty. They generally favored decentralization, independence, and other libertarian principles much more strongly than the Alliance, and they often clashed with other rebel groups over the goal of restoring the Republic. These neo-separatists were often disliked by other rebel groups, especially those led by former loyalists such as the Alliance. However, they agreed with other rebel groups about one thing: revolution against the Empire. This usually led to an uneasy alliance, but not always. In the Atravis sector, for example, Separatists and rebels fought each other as well as local Imperial forces during the early stages of the rebellion. As the Alliance to restore the Republic became the dominant rebel faction, however, the Neo-Separatists faded away. Some joined the alliance and changed their views, others were wiped out by the Empire, and the rest faded into irrelevance. But that was our look at the different philosophies of the rebellion and the leaders who define them. But what do you think? Would you like to see more Rebel content in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you